These are all of my juggling books. This is my entire juggling book collection, for the most part. I do have some circus books, a bunch of circus books actually, that do mention juggling, but these are all the ones that are dedicated specifically to the topic of juggling, and I want to share them with you today. Whew, juggle in the books, am I right? Anyway, before I get into the books themselves, I want to give you a teensy bit of juggling history. So prior to the 1940s, there weren't that many publications dedicated to juggling. There was, for instance, Juggling Secrets by Will Goldston. This has been republished by Neil Stunker. And there was Juggling or How to Become a Juggler by Rupert Inglis and republished by Modern Vaudeville Press. But both of these books are kind of aimed at the performer of juggling. You can probably tell from the cover of Juggling Secrets, that guy's a gentleman juggler. That guy is learning his craft so that he can perform it for an audience and they can be entertained and he can make money off of that. Personally, I perform juggling sometimes, but not always, and I don't have to. I'm a hobbyist juggler, so I can kind of do with juggling whatever I want. It just so happens that sometimes the thing that I want to get out of juggling is performance, because I'm also a performance studies scholar, and I used to be a theater artist as well. So what I'm trying to say is there wasn't a big hobbyist juggling community at the time. Everyone doing juggling was doing it for performance, for money. But there was a young man named Roger Montandon who got his hands on a copy of Rupert Inglis' book, and he learned how to juggle, and he performed in his, high school talent show with his juggling. He did a little bit of semi-professional juggling in college. He went to college to be an electrical engineer, and then he got out of college and he went and became an electrical engineer at the Weight Manufacturing Company. But he kept juggling because he loved juggling. And he loved juggling so much that he turned one of the offices above the Weight Manufacturing Company's plants into a little press for a juggling publication called The Juggler's Bulletin. And he was also manufacturing juggling props and magic texts as well. Because at this time, the early 1940s now, juggling was kind of like within the bubble of magic. Jugglers didn't have a community of their own, there was no convention specific to juggling, so the jugglers would attend the International Brotherhood of Magicians annual convention. And Roger, he noticed this, so he started putting out his bulletin. He got a couple jugglers on board, they would subscribe to his bulletin and he would send it out, and a little community was starting to form around the bulletin, so he used his bulletin as a place to start calling for a kind of brotherhood of jugglers. At the IBM convention in 1947, the IJA was formed, or the International Jugglers Association. The IJA continued publishing the Jugglers Bulletin for a couple of years, and then they got their own newsletter, and then they started publishing something called Juggler's World, and then the next iteration was something called Juggle Magazine. And I have one copy of Juggle Magazine here with me today because I actually visited the man on the cover, David Kane. He is a performing professional juggler, he's a member of the IJA, and he has a juggling history museum in his house where he collects a bunch of old props, as well as publications and other juggling paraphernalia. So he sent me home with my very own copy of Juggle Magazine, and I would love to collect other editions of this magazine, so if you know of where I can find any, then please let me know in the comments or reach out to me at my email address in YouTube. This is actually the copy from 2005, but Juggle Magazine honestly was great. Like, I've spent some time flipping through this, and there are jugglers' biographies that are like many pages long. There are some really in-depth and wonderful instructions for how to juggle certain site swaps, which is juggling notation, we'll talk about that later, and how to perform other juggling techniques. And when the IJA stopped publishing Juggle Magazine, they went to a fully online system of communication. So now we have eJuggle, which is an online, essentially, juggling magazine. It doesn't come out with regular issues, but everything they do come out with is announced in the newsletter, which they still publish, but now it's an email newsletter. And of course, they're also publishing on various platforms like YouTube and Spotify. They have a podcast called Drop Everything with Dan Holtzman. Tricks of the Month is a single video dedicated to a single juggler that's usually doing a single prop each month, and they're really wonderful, beautiful videos. All that stuff goes through the IJA. This isn't sponsored or anything, but I'm an IJA member and I love the IJA and I love juggling, and if you're interested in juggling or reading about juggling, then the IJA is the place to go. I think their address is literally just juggle.org, but I'll put it on the screen now. Anyway, I've gotten ahead of myself. I just thought it was important to start by mentioning the IJA and all of the publications that they've put out, because a lot of the other books that I have, the people that wrote them dedicate their books to the IJA, or they mention the IJA as the place to go to get resources. So the IJA started in 1947, but it remains to this day like the #1 resource for jugglers, the place to go if you want to get into juggling. But let's go back in time a little bit.
Now here's a convention in a juggler vein. It's the third annual reunion of the International Jugglers Convention.
So the IJA started. Of course, there became more interest from non-performers, aka hobbyists like myself, in juggling when the IJA formed, and there was finally a community around this hobby. But it wasn't until the late 1970s when juggling would feel a really big boom. Like, the public was taking notice. And that is when this book was published. This is Juggling for the Complete Klutz by John Cassidy. Perhaps you have heard of Klutz. They are now a subsidiary of Scholastic Inc., but they are still publishing workbooks like this one for various crafts and hobbies. This was their first piece though. John Cassidy fell in love with juggling. He thought he could spread it to the world, so he wrote this little book. He made a couple bean bags to be sold with it. You can see the little hole where the bean bags would have been attached to this book. So him and two of his friends started selling this book out of their backpack on their bicycles. And by the end of, the day of selling these books, they'd made 35 bucks. So they thought, dang, this could be successful. $35 whole. And they went on to sell over 1 million copies in a decade. People have attributed the popularity of juggling at this time to this book, and it's honestly a super wonderful, accessible book because, unlike the other publications I mentioned previously, which geared themselves towards performers, Klutz's mission was to take juggling off of the stage. They were like, this is too good to only give it to the performers. This is super accessible, super welcoming, super basic. Oftentimes I find there's a barrier to people learning to juggle because they feel like it's specifically something they can't do. Like, juggling gets defined as this thing that is fundamentally difficult and requires extreme dexterity, and so a lot of people just think that means they can't do it. But this book really subverts that idea of juggling by aiming it at the klutz. I have a friend who always says it's so silly when people say that they don't have the hand-eye coordination for juggling, or that they're really clumsy and so they could never juggle, and he's always like, juggling's the antidote to clumsiness. Juggling is how you improve your hand-eye coordination. So don't let any of those mental barriers be a boundary on you learning to juggle. There are also many different styles of juggling in which you don't even let the prop leave your hand. Like, for instance, I love hat juggling. The next guy we have to talk about is Dave Finnegan. Dave learned to juggle at 34 and he immediately fell in love with it. He literally quit his doctoral degree before finishing so that he could go preach the love of juggling to the world.
Everybody wants to know how to juggle.
He's written 4 books about juggling. He's won national awards in the US for his juggling video and music series. And one of those books, which I own but I can't find right now, is called The Complete Juggler. And this book, which was published in like the late 1980s, went way past what Klutz was doing with their book. The Complete Juggler teaches hat juggling, devil stick juggling, cigar boxes. It also even teaches aspects of how to build community within juggling. The book is dedicated to the IJA, and he actually teaches his readers how to start a juggling festival, what to expect when you go to a juggling festival. He talks about the benefits of juggling no matter like what type of person you are. And at the end of every chapter, he has these certification requirements where he says, if you can do this, 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 and this, you're like a certified cigar box juggler. I find for me personally, it is much easier to learn something if I have this goal in mind, if I can like check those goals off of a list, and Dave Finnegan gave people that. Honestly, if you want a wide variety of styles of juggling to explore, then I think that you should turn to The Complete Juggler even to this day. That said, if you are actually looking for a book to learn to juggle from, there is one I would recommend. It was published just in 2020, and it's from Modern Vaudeville Press again. It's called Juggling: What It Is and How to Do It, a not-so-brief introduction to the world's most underrated pastime, by Tom Wall, with special guests Jay Gilligan and Fritz Grobe, and with help from Benjamin Domask. What is so great about this book is that it teaches sight swap notation. Sight swap is a way that we can understand juggling through mathematics. It is how jugglers notate and communicate juggling to each other, and it was simultaneously invented by 3 different groups of jugglers in the early 1980s, so just before Dave Finnegan was publishing his book, which is probably why Finnegan's book doesn't mention sight swap and Wall's does. These 3 groups of jugglers simultaneously discovered this juggling mathematical theory at about the same time, and it's been argued that that's in a large part because of Juggling for the Complete Klutz. More people were thinking about juggling right now, and of course that includes mathematicians. So in this book, Wall actually teaches the basics of site swap. There's an appendix all about site swap. He teaches juggling tricks as site swaps. So whereas the Complete Juggler talked about a pattern called the seesaw, which appears to basically be something we call the box today, Tom actually teaches the box as its site swap, which is bracket 4, 2x bracket asterisk. And while we're on the topic of site swap, I really quickly want to mention a book called The Mathematics of Juggling that was published in 2003. It's by mathematician Burkhard Polster. So of course this is coming out after site swap has been established for some time. So it is the first comprehensive account of the mathematical techniques and results used in the modeling of juggling patterns. And it says that the book is accessible at all levels of mathematical sophistication. It's a book for mathematically wired jugglers, mathematical bell ringers, combinatorists, mathematics educators, and just about anybody interested in beautiful and unusual applications of mathematics. Now, I'm not sure that this is accessible at all levels of mathematical sophistication because I do find it very dense and difficult to get through, and a review of this book at the time said that it really feels like it is aimed specifically at mathematicians, not even jugglers, because there are not so many practical juggling applications presented in this book. It really is just focusing on the underlying mathematical theory, but if that's your jam, then you should definitely grab this one. There's a couple other juggling instructional manuals that I should mention here because I do own them, one of which is the ebook for Pearls of Juggling by Anthony Traher. This book does teach some juggling technique, but it's more focused on the performer, I would say, and it's most focused on juggling as a creative outlet, as a form of meditation. Traher's whole life is dedicated to introducing more playfulness into people's lives, and he is doing this in a large part through his teaching of juggling in this book, as well as through sharing his life story in his next book, which literally just came out, so I haven't read it yet, called Meeting Life, which is a document of his personal journey to France when all he had were his juggling skills, his love of juggling, and a backpack. Pearls of Juggling, though, is beautiful. It has many illustrations throughout that he got done by students at a comic art school in Italy. So if you are looking for ways to enhance the creativity of your juggling, or kind of slow down and enjoy your juggling a little more, or add movement quality to your juggling, then look no further than the Pearls of Juggling. I'll also mention Dr. Bob Woodburn's books. I think both of these were given to me by people that knew that I juggled, and Bob Woodburn actually lived in Guelph, Ontario at the time of writing these books. I don't know if he still does, but that's probably why I acquired them in this area. And at a bookstore called BMV in Toronto, I also found this one, The Ultimate Juggling Book, an illustrated guide to tricks and techniques by Richard Dingman. To this day, I can't say I've ever been to a dedicated juggling store personally. I get most of my juggling equipment when I go to juggling festivals because there are often vendors that show up or are invited, but pretty much every magic store that I've been to has had a section of juggling stuff or juggling books alongside their magic books, and at one of those stores I found this book, 3 Club Juggling by Dick Franco. In a used bookstore where I live, I found this book by Hovey Burgess, who is a juggler, and he was actually one of the first people who was teaching juggling to acting students and really believed that learning circus techniques would benefit the theater actor. And I found his book, Circus Techniques, Juggling, Equilibristics, Vaulting. It has a really interesting setup. I'll show you a picture of the table of contents. It kind of goes from like the basics to the more complex in each one of these circus arts. I haven't read this book yet, but it does feature some interesting juggling options like foot juggling, knife throwing, weapons manipulation, rope spinning, parasol spinning. So kind of a neat find, I thought, coming out of the circus world rather than like the magic or specifically juggling world. Maybe a couple years ago you remember a viral Wired video about juggling that was something about the physics of juggling and how many balls were physically possible to juggle, and one of the people that was featured in that video was Jack Calvin. This is his book, When Balls Collide, Understanding the Skill of Juggling with Arthur Lubell. I bought this at an IJA festival a couple years ago and I got it signed by both of them. And now we have to talk about a suite of books that I have that are actually by this guy, who we talked about earlier, David Kane, the juggler and juggling historian. He is an extremely extremely prolific writer on eJuggle, the IJA's online magazine. He has been through so many archival materials about juggling. The guy's mind is like an encyclopedia for juggling. He knows everything, and those eJuggle articles that he's published throughout the years, he's also sort of turned them into books. And one year at an IJA festival, he brought his entire juggling history museum to the festival, transported all of those historic props and let us check them out, and he was also selling his entire collection of juggling history books for just one pretty low price. So I bought all of them, and they make a really beautiful collection on the shelf. I honestly don't refer to them that much because they are not set up as like compelling narratives. It really is just facts and pictures. There's no index, there's no works cited page. Things are usually organized alphabetically. So for instance, his book on great female jugglers of the past, it's just a list of female jugglers, and they are not organized chronologically or by prop or anything like that. They're just organized by the alphabet. So they're a little bit hard to gather information from in my experience, but they are wonderful little books to flip through and just like learn a little bit of information, a little bit of juggling trivia from. I don't know if he's published anything else since I got these ones in like 2017, but the ones that I have are Great Female Jugglers of the Past, Rediscovering History's Great Jugglers, Volume 1 and 2, Juggling Props, A History, Volume 1 and 2, and Uncovering Juggling History, Volume 1 and 2. Speaking of juggling history, the only other juggling history book that I have is Juggling from Antiquity to the Middle Ages, The Forgotten History of Throwing and Catching by Tom Wall through Modern Vaudeville Press, which I think I've mentioned on this channel before, but this one is organized by region of the world, and it really looks at throwing and catching as a pastime prior to when juggling became considered juggling as we know it today, because that didn't happen until like 1891 when a juggler named Paul Cinquevalli said, "What I do is not conjuring, what I do is not magic, what I do is juggling," and he actually divorced juggling from magic and other performance forms because juggling used to be synonymous with many different performance forms in like the Middle Ages. So if you want like an introductory history of throwing and catching around the world, this is a fun little book. I feel like I've been recording forever, but I really wanted to save the best for last. So firstly, I have talked about on this channel before, this massive beast of a book, Juggling Trajectories, Gandini Juggling 1991 to 2015. I'm so proud to own this. It was expensive. Shipping was a nightmare because it's so heavy and it was coming from the UK, but this is written by Thomas J.M. Wilson, and it really does chronicle Gandini Juggling's history with gorgeous images, wonderful like art theory and analysis of their juggling shows. Gandini Juggling are phenomenal. If you haven't heard of them, you should check out one of their shows. They tour internationally. Just their website alone is cool. They're such a cool company. They typically partner juggling, specifically site swaps, with various forms of dance. I think probably right now they are most well known for something called Smashed, which was both a black box and an outdoor theater piece where all of the props were apples, except at the end when they start juggling tea sets, like dishes, and smashing them on stage. And that was an homage to the dancer Peanut Bausch. And then another work that they did was for Akhenaten, the Philip Glass opera, which you might have heard about because there was a bunch of jugglers in the opera. And then lastly, one of the most recent books that I've purchased, it was published in 2022. This is John Udry's book, The ABC Tour, 26 shows, 26 letters, one juggler. I wasn't sure if I wanted to buy this book. I knew that I liked John Udry because he visited the IJA festival one year and I saw him perform and he was hilarious. His stuff is so creative and original and approachable, but I didn't know what the ABC Tour was. I did end up ordering the book because I knew I was going to make this video and I was like, the more the merrier. So the concept that John Udry was pursuing and ended up turning into this book was to perform a juggling show in 26 different venues where each venue had to start with the next letter of the alphabet. So, you know, for C, he juggled in a castle. For P, he juggled in a pig pen for pigs. For H, he juggled at the hairdressers. And hilariously, for N, he juggled in a naturist resort. And although most performers at the naturist resort would not actually juggle naked, John Udry went all the way, and this book is complete with high-quality color images of every place he juggled on this tour. I read just the preface of this book and I was already laughing out loud. John Udry is so funny, and amazingly, that funniness comes through in text form. I unfortunately didn't see any of the shows in the ABC Tour. I didn't even know this tour was a thing that he was doing until the book came out, and I am so glad that he published his journey because it's so funny and so fascinating And as a theater student who has been interested in site-specific theater and immersive theater, and also the performance of space and material and the non-human, the fact that he is tailoring each of these shows to the venue itself, and the venues are unconventional performance spaces, just really tickles my brain. And I haven't read the whole book yet. I've only read segments of it because I picked it up and I couldn't put it down. It was so funny and genius, but I can't wait to keep reading this one because wow, did John Udry just commit to the bit with this. If you're watching this because you're already a juggler, please feel free to let me know which other books I need to own in the comment section below. And if you're watching this and you're like, what the heck? I did not know people were that into juggling, then I urge you to pick up juggling for yourself and find out why I'm so into it and why all these people decided to publish books on the technique and the mathematics and the performance of juggling. That's all from me for this video. I hope you enjoyed me finally starting to share some of my love for juggling with my YouTube audience, because this space is mostly about taking notes, but I do love to get outside and start throwing some objects around when I'm not writing about juggling for my dissertation. So I'll see you all in the comment section below and in another video soon.